All right, welcome back, everybody. Right now, we're going to have a keynote by Jeff Manber. He has quite an extensive resume with experience in utilization in LEO in both manned and unmanned space. He started at Pan Am-Sat, which was the first privately owned international satellite venture, and was quite involved in helping the American and Russian space programs partner during the 90s. And now he's firing CubeSats out of the ISS with
on schedule.
Which is totally awesome. And they're not only working with CubeSats, but they're also doing space station payloads, and they've done a great job of working themselves into the press. Recently this week, they announced a partnership with Blue Origin to help them do scientific payloads on suborbital flight. Also used a lot in the language within NASA and really regarded in a high sense. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff, and let's all give him a warm welcome.
Okay. Is the mic on? Is the mic on? Is the mic on? Is it working? Working? Okay. I have something. Everybody for coming out on a Saturday, and I first want to say, just give a shout out to all the volunteers. We saw them on stage before. I just think they're doing a great job. I think this is one of the best NewSpace conferences I've been to, and I think everyone involved should feel very proud about how well it's going. What I wanted to do this morning was talk about space stations. And what have we learned? I mean, we isolate ourselves so much. You know, people today are looking at International Space Station, and we're looking at utilization at NanoRacks. We're focused a lot on how you can use International Space Station. But we don't really think about, well, what were the lessons from the Mir? Hey, what happened from the Mir? What can we take from the Mir that applies to ISS, and what can we take from ISS that takes us to the next levels? So I thought I would just take a few minutes here and just talk about, just personally, from my perspective, and then we have a panel after this where we really have some good people talking about where do we go next with space stations. So first, let me start by saying the obvious for everybody in this business, that rockets are cool, okay? And something else that's new, there's lots of them. And this is really new. And you know, we've never had before so many launch vehicles that are available for use. And of course, as we all know, there are so many more coming. And in my view, if even half the launch vehicle that we hear about come to fruition, to operational status, we will have so many opportunities to get to low Earth orbit and beyond. Those are commercial vehicles, there'll be competition, they'll be going to different orbits, and the question is, you know, where are they going to go? And that's what brings up space stations. And of course, we had the lunar program, but right now, I see the coming of a golden era, a golden time, where with the operational launch vehicles, with commercial pricing, with taking the learn from space stations, there's no doubt in my mind that we can envision in 5 to 10 years a lot of choices as to where we go in space. And so for now, this morning, I just want to space stations. And this is a presentation I put together a little quickly, just wanted to divide things out. I mean, we had Salyut, we had Skylab. Those had zero commercial utilization. And then we had the Mir, and we had the International Space Station, both of which had commercial use. And I've been real lucky because I marketed and did business development for both the Mir and now the International Space Station. And first I worked with RKK Energia, the Russian organization that's today the prime integrator on the Russian side for a space station. And I worked with them on the business development for the Mir. And that was about 94, 96, around that time. And then I worked, I was head of Mir Corp, the Dutch company at the turn of the century, which leased the Mir space station for about 2 years. And each experience, I've really had 3 different chapters in looking at space stations. And I've taken away and am taking away, from ISS today, different parts of the puzzle. And for me, the end game is, how do we do this commercially, purely commercially? And is that possible? So first, I think there's an asterisk there. Yeah, this comes, I think it says, this comes from my memory and observation. This is not written in stone, these numbers. This is just something, Jeff Faust, don't tweet these as the Bible, But it's interesting as I sat down and just thought about it. One of the striking things, and the vast disagreement always between the American side and the Russian side, was to the Russians, sending astronauts to the station is a commercial venture. And when they reached that agreement with ESA, where ESA would pay to have their astronauts go to the Mir, it overturned the entire, at that time, 40-year history where it was done diplomatically. And to the Russians, to Energia specifically, it was business. Energia is providing a service. We have a customer. The customer is ESA. And today, the Russians view it the same way. They work with ESA. They work with NASA. They provide a service, sending astronauts to and from the International Space Station. So one of the first things that struck me when I put together this chart was that the ESA crew on Mir was probably the largest source of revenue for the Russians. Space tourism, and these are just guesses, and it's not really an honest number, but I don't know if I'm still under NDAs after 20 years, but I don't know. I didn't want to go through honest numbers. But fair amount, this is during the time of working with Energia. We had some advertising. We did an Israeli milk commercial. We did a couple of other things, and just guessing, it was about 8 million. And we had some biopharma, and it's interesting to see how young Earth observation, you'll see on the International Space Station, Earth observation is really maturing today, and I only see more of that coming. And then at Mir Corp, of course, the European Space Agency and NASA disliked what we were doing at Mir Corp, so we lost the commercial crew, but we had media and branding. And we had signed with Mark Burnett of Survivor and NBC, where the winner would go to space. We had signed Dennis Tito. We had a space agency that still I don't talk about that agreed to fly with us. We had a deal with Fox, the Murdoch family, where we would do cosmonauts doing weather broadcasting during weather emergencies. Okay, so you see there, we had the space tourism, which was the Dennis Tito flight, and we had media and branding. And so you see immediately that the 2 major markets on the Mir were the commercial services to get folks up there and back, and media. And then when you look at the ISS, and then again, as I say, this was just taken, fairly quickly. Again, you see, I'm just guessing, there's probably been close to $1 billion that has been transferred to Roscosmos from the U.S. and the Europeans for, there was 21 ESA astronauts, I think, and I didn't, as I said, I did this quickly. I don't know how many NASA. You got the satellite deployment. NanoRacks has taken the lead on the ISS in deploying small sats. I know the Japanese have had some commercial projects. Earth observation, when you look at what EarthCast is doing on both the Russian side and now with NanoRacks on the American side, it probably has a valuation, probably is costing about $100 million. You got Space Adventures still doing the space tourists. And now you're beginning to see more diverse. And the point here, obviously NanoRacks is not involved in all these, but on the retail level, now we have high schools going, we have universities going, we have biopharmaceutical companies, and we've never had such a range of commercial utilization on space stations. We didn't have that on the Mir, and really through NanoRacks, we're getting to see a diversity. But it's an interesting diversity in that, and here's some of my friends in the industry and at NASA may disagree with me, but for example, we have DLR as a customer at times. I count them as commercial. We have ESA as a customer today. I count them as commercial. And the reason I count them as commercial is we didn't answer an RFP. They come to us for a service to use our hardware that we own, and I treat them no differently than anyone is treated in any industry. And whether you're with a government or whether you're with a commercial sector or university, you're agreeing in this case to use NanoRacks hardware for a service, and if we don't perform, we don't get paid. And so for me, this distinction in the industry, we can't, if NASA's a customer, it's not commercial. I think that's a ridiculous distinction. If it's commercial and they're paying for services, it works for me. So Corp in 18 months produced more business outside of the crew transportation than in the previous years with the same space station. And why is that? And the answer is, it was a better story, it was more commercial, and there were things we could do. We could do things like this. You can't do that today. Okay, I was involved in the Pizza Hut, for those who remember that, and when you have a commercial system, when you talk about today with NASA folks and they say, how can you think about having a commercial system? Really, when you begin to look at the entire range of meteorites, who controls the launch vehicles, who's controlling the crew on board? Is it a government crew? Are they private citizens? When you begin to look at the whole puzzle together, you can begin to see that revenue levels, utilization, excitement, relevance to society goes way, way up. Up to now, we've only seen glimmers of this. A little bit with the Mir. We're seeing it a little bit with ISS. But we're not there. We have not had a commercial platform yet. So one of the interesting things is a lot of people come in and say, oh man, the revenue from the commercial sector on ISS is, what have you done? 20 million, 30 million worth of business. But there's another part of that puzzle, and that's what's the valuation that's been created. And I'm really, really pleased how well NASA and Congress gets this. NASA completely gets today that what we're doing on the station with Planet Labs creates jobs. It creates a valuation. You go to their facilities up the road here, and you see everybody just building those CubeSats and everything going on. Never mind, they're probably along Earthcast and they're going to change the way we view the Earth from a very pragmatic, hard-nosed way that Congress looks at things, and hence NASA has to look at things. The metric for me in working commercial is different than working with research. In research, they look at patents, they look at how many scientists or how many announcements are being made. For me, the valuation of the customers is and if we were failing at NanoRacks, then Planet Labs would have been delayed a couple of years in realizing their ambitions. And Earthcast, which started on the Russian side, would not have a valuation of probably about 400 million. These are just guesses. What I've seen in the newspapers and on the web and stuff like that. And my friends from Made in Space are here, and idea, but I wanted to include them, but I have no idea what their valuation is. But their work on the station, one of the metrics is you take Made in Space, and when you take the fact that they have a 3D printer, well, okay, that's cool, but a lot of kids have 3D printers now. Okay, what gives it a valuation, what makes it interesting, is not even what they're doing on the space station today. It's what does it open up for tomorrow, and changes the way we think about doing space utilization and in-space services in the future. You start talking about not needing as much upmass. You start talking about being able to do things almost instantly and have a wrench produced on the space station. There's both a need and there's both a valuation. And that's what commercial is bringing to the table. So some thoughts on what's necessary for the customers and the owners. When I was working at Corp, When the Mir was deorbited, we had $170 million in assigned revenue. And I would say that the cost of operating the Mir at that time, this is 1999, 2000, was probably about that. We were probably breaking even. If we had stayed aloft and in orbit and we had realized that revenue, we would have probably about broken even. I'd say it's about $200 million in 1999 dollars at that time. And so you can't consider a true commercial venture without making sure your costs for operations are as low as possible. It has to be efficient. You know, we're not going to be able in the future to go to NASA, the U.S. government, speaking as an American here from an American perspective, and ask for funding for operations. You're going to have to operate this thing at an even pace. We have to have government as customer. Let's just agree, let's take a vote, NewSpace 2015. Government as customer is okay, it's commercial. It's okay, it's good, it's necessary. There is no, I mean, this is not the only industry that depends on the government, you know, as a principal customer. And it's absolutely necessary for the foreseeable future. We are going to need government help on the space transportation, but as we look out on looking at commercial platforms, we envision, just like today at NanoRacks, we receive no funding from NASA or the US government, but we do envision getting money for our services. Follow the market. Everybody for 20 years, the first major breakthrough on space station would be discover the cure for cancer. Everybody knows it, everybody knew it. We found out Japanese had this great CubeSat deployer. We tried it. Our first customer was Vietnamese. And after that, wow, everybody wanted to deploy. And guess what? The first major breakthrough in utilization on the station was CubeSat deployment. It had a time, it had a place, it's helped American industry, it's helped international. We've flown Peru, we've flown Lithuania, we introduced Lithuania to space. We helped Spira get going as NanoSatisfy. And so if you're talking about a commercial platform, you can't go in there with preconceived notions. And this is the problem when Congress and government is directing. They set goals, they fund hardware, and it could turn out that that hardware doesn't have a relevance to the users, or it may turn out that something else that's developed in the meantime. I'm not even sure CubeSats existed. I guess not when ISS was first, you know, planned and developed. And the Japanese JAXA had the foresight to put in a CubeSat deployer, and they made it so it fit 3U. Because no one could envision there would be a need for more than the occasional CubeSat deployment. Well, that turned out to be wrong. And the private sector could move fast. We saw the need. We went to NASA. We went to JAXA. We didn't ask for funding. We said, would you give us permission if we take the chance? And we invested about $1 million. And for us, that's a lot of money. And so we've shown a win for industry and a win for utilization. So you have to follow the market. The point here is you can't say, I'm going to, you know, you can't have a group of people telling you where to go. You have to follow what the customer base is. You need a good story. That is something that government completely does not understand, completely does not get, that it's not just availability. There's got to be a story. A person has to give you money, and they give you money for a reason. Whether if it's space tourism, it's aspiration, it's your dreams, it's personal fulfillment. If it's biofarm, you're shortening the time period. But even in the examples of biofarm or others, they don't want to be associated with something that may not tell a good story. And they want to, in the beginning, the International Space Station told a great story of cooperation, partnership with former enemies, and today it's getting a little, the waters are getting a little choppy. And that's going to be an interesting next couple of years, and you know, I hope that with our good friends in Russia and the space community, we get through this period. But you have to be able to tell a good story, else utilization is just not possible. And then the ability to grow space platforms as the market grows. There's two there. One, if it's not a government-funded facility, you build it only as big as the market supports and the projected growth. ISS was built for political purposes. Every member nation made a contribution. It's big. It's expensive. And so building the ISS, I would have started with a little, flyer, a free flyer, and said, that's Japanese, that's Russian, that's that, and built it as we went along, because I'm always worried about making sure that your revenue is greater than your costs. It's a concept, okay? Have a good purpose, okay? Again, it goes back to the story. ISS has a mixed message, not as much today, but the message in the beginning was political. For our European friends, ISS was almost purely political. They were doing it to work with the Americans, and then later it became the Russians. For us, it was both political suddenly, we're working with the Russians, and yes, it was the utilization, the dream of breakthroughs in pharmaceutical discoveries. And we had mixed messages depending whether you were the White House, whether you were Congress, or whether you were a researcher trying to use the space station. You need, in commercial, as we move forward, you need a story. Is it a hotel? Is it something to take space tourists? Fine, that's what it is. Is it a biopharma workshop? Is it a satellite deployer that's sitting up there? Is it Earth observation, situational awareness? You need to be able to go in and say, this is what it is, you're the customer, and everything is. And diversity of location. ISS, my colleagues at NanoRacks always refer to ISS as the Goldilocks orbit. No one's really satisfied with it, but you know what? It's great, turns out to be good for Earth observation. But it was selected because it would allow the Russians to get to the station here. That's great. Now we're going to have two. We're going to have the ISS and we're going to have the Chinese. That's good. We need 3 locations. We need 4 locations. And so one of the things that I'm hopeful is that in the next decade, next 15 years, that there'll be a multiplicity of locations where you can go depending on your commercial or strategic needs. And finally, whenever I speak, I put in a plug for my favorite thing that most of you know nothing about, the IGA. The IGA is the Intergovernmental Agreement. It's how the space station runs. And I call it the Magna Carta of space. Okay, it has survived 10, 15 years. It has some wonderful provisions. Section 8 is a waiver of third-party liability. You can't get sued. If we put a product up there and it does something bad, I can't get sued. NanoRacks can't get sued. The person that developed the payload can't get sued. There's other provisions that have clearly withstood the test of time, and there's nothing that can be said more as a compliment to a legal document in that it's worked for 15, 20 years now. And I can suggest some improvements. One is that there's no discussion of taking money. It's unclear how NanoRacks can pay NASA sometimes for services on the station. It's unclear how I could pay Roscosmos at times. And so I just want to always put in that when you think of destinations, and it's wonderful to think of asteroid mining and lunar colonies. One of the key questions for someone like me that lives in the day-to-day of space station operation is, under what legal framework? Okay, and it's a very important question even now today for the Earth observation community. As we're seeing more and more private capital funding going to Earth observation, they're beginning to ask questions like, what is the exact legal regime that we're working on? Who truly does own the data? How do you do the cutoff switch? Is that permissible? And in my business, my sector of the marketplace, it's about ownership. Do we really own the hardware on the International Space Station? That has some implications. So the legal regime is in one sense boring, but it's terribly exciting for me because that's how you get investor capital. The more that the more that the basic questions that we assume here on the ground are answered up in space, the more investors that you'll get and more sophisticated investors. So really just sort of wrapping it up, we've had a wonderful time of maybe 10 or 12 years or something with the space station up there. Extraordinarily stable time. Here in the States, we've had bipartisan support. It's one of the few areas where the White House and Congress work together. It's one of the few areas where some of the nations work together. It really is an extraordinary story. But at some point, it will come to an end. And the question that I think the panel that I'm on as well, coming up next, is going to talk about is, how do you make that transition? How do we make sure there's no gap going on like we had with the shuttle and with Skylab, et cetera, et cetera? We're building up momentum on the station. We're building up new users, exciting ideas, private capital, valuation. It's an extraordinary story. And if we goof this, if we blow this, and we come down or stop ISS before there's something that's there next, we'll just start back at zero again, or this time it will be over. And, or to put it more bluntly, we'll leave to other nations to control the LEO utilization. So at NanoRacks, tomorrow is today. We're focused on space stations. We're focused on destinations. We're focused on building the customer base. We're asking the questions about legal regime, investment, capital. We have customers now questioning, how much money do I put into station? If station's coming down 2024, I'll put X amount in. If it's coming down 2028, we'll put in more. So very real questions, which is a great sign of the health of the only space station up there right now. So that's really it. That's where we are on destinations, and look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
There's a couple of space organizations that have suggested that we augment and replace the NSS with a policy similar to the COTS program that was used to develop Falkland. The government does partial funding, but the end result is privately owned and operated, and then the government becomes anchor tenant. Is that a good model? Is that a bad model? What do you think?
I think you said three key words that make most people at NASA and Congress go crazy. Okay, I mean, from anchor tenant to, partially funded. I mean, in theory, what you're saying, I'll put in language that's more palatable, I think, today in Congress and in NASA, where you say, look, we have to get to the next level. We're going to need some public funding of this, but we don't want to own it. We don't want to control it. And we'll put in some public money, I think Congress may say at one point, if you in the private sector step up, put in some funding, but you just can't never say the word anchor. Those days are gone. Anchor tenant. It's a taboo word. Okay, and so yes, that's probably one direction we're going. At NanoRacks, we don't like that. We don't want government funding to develop your hardware. If they could do it in a manner where they truly do let you develop your hardware, run it, operate it. It's different than launch vehicles because, as I'm explaining, it's a home, it's a house, it's got laws, it's got people, so we're nervous about that. But if it can be done, if it can be done correctly, then of course that is the way to go.
What are some of the elements or some of the negotiating factors that went into moving away from selling through RFP to selling the way you're selling now?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. We went to NASA 5 years ago, and we saw that the station was being underutilized. And I just think, especially when you have a home in space, the government was just moving too slow. And they were still focused on ending the construction process. And we went to NASA 5 years ago and said, we have a proposition for you. I said, we don't want your money. And that got their attention. Okay? And we said, let us build our own hardware or buy our own hardware. We'll buy it. We'll put it up on the station. Let us market to whom we choose, as long as we honor the respect of being part of the U.S. National Lab. And to our surprise, and perhaps to NASA's surprise, they said yes. And so it was a short circuit. I mean, it wasn't a long, it was just, here's a proposition. We'll put our money in. And today, NanoRacks is probably in for about $20 million now, if some of these projects go forward on the station. Small amount of money, but a big amount of money. And so we're able to do what we wish with an extent with that hardware. So it wasn't a long, drawn-out discussion. It was just, okay, let's try it. We started small with Nano Labs, not a lot of money on the table. Let's just see, and we've just grown. So, yes, sir.
It seems that NanoRacks is pretty tightly bound to the International Space Station. Do you have any projects in the works that would kind of, break that paradigm and allow you to do free flyers and things of that nature?
Yeah, well, the first thing is we announced yesterday, I'm really pleased that Blue Origin has chosen to team with us, allowing NanoRacks to do the business development for Blue Origin and to do the payload development. And so, yes, we're looking to move, and Blue, New Shepard is the first platform. So thank you. I'm being signaled that, so thank you. And what can we take from ISS that takes us to the next levels? So I thought I would just take a few minutes here and just talk about, just personally, from my perspective, and then we have a panel after this where we really have some good people talking about where do we go next with space stations. So first, let me start by saying the obvious for everybody in this business, that rockets are cool, okay? And something else that's new, there's lots of them. And this is really new. And we've never had before so many launch vehicles that are available.
Language within NASA and really regarded in a high sense. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff, and let's all give him a warm welcome.
Okay. Is the mic on? Is the mic on? Is the mic on? Is it working? Working? Okay. I have something. Everybody for coming out on a Saturday, and I first want to say, just give a shout out to all the volunteers. We saw them on stage before. I just think they're doing a great job. I think this is one of the best NewSpace conferences I've been to, and I think everyone involved should feel very proud about how well it's going. What I wanted to do this morning was talk about space stations. And what have we learned? I mean, we isolate ourselves so much. People today are looking at International Space Station, and we're looking at utilization at NanoRacks. We're focused a lot on how you can use International Space Station. But we don't really think about, well, what were the lessons from the Mir? Hey, what happened from the Mir? What can we take from the Mir that applies to ISS?
All right, welcome back, everybody. Right now, we're going to have a keynote by Jeff Manber. He has quite an extensive resume with experience in utilization in LEO, in both manned and unmanned space. He started at Pan Am-Sat, which was the first privately owned international satellite venture, and was quite involved in helping the American and Russian space programs partner during the 90s. And now he's firing CubeSats out of the ISS with
On
Nano.
schedule.
Yeah, which is totally awesome. And they're not only working with CubeSats, but they're also doing space station payloads, and they've done a great job of working themselves into the press. Recently this week, they announced a partnership with Blue Origin to help them do scientific payloads on suborbital flight. Also used a lot in the